Forgive me if I speak quickly, but I have a lot to say tonight. First of all, I've got a preparation. I'm going to be doing a video for each class over your discussion on week 3. Really outstanding stuff on culture. In fact, it's pretty complicated, so I want to thank you. The wonderful discussions. I hope I don't talk too long. All right, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to talk about a thing called, I'll get to it in a minute, a model of intercultural awareness, which I call the cultural awareness scales. And I'm going to be introducing that this week. You also have a reading in chapter 3, but treat that pretty lightly. I'm not going to quiz you over chapter 3 in banks, but I want you to just glance over it and look at that one page and emphasize on the instructions for this week. There's a couple of pages there I want you to spend a little more time on. Also, we got an interview coming up with a person that works with different cultures in schools. This can be anyone you select that has some experience working with diversity. Could be in a big school, small school, could be a teacher, principal, could be a counselor. It should be somebody that works in schools of some sort with diversity. I'm going to move that back a whole month, so it won't be due instead of the 13th of October, it's going to be due on the 27th of October, which gives you a couple of more weeks beyond what it was. We only have that plus the finale in December as major units. Otherwise, we're reading and looking at videos and discussing. So I think that should make the semester go pretty smoothly. I'll be sending you some interview questions for ideas, and you can always email me with questions about those interviews. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'll be talking about week 3 after I've compiled all that in some notes. So I'm trying to do your discussions without just replying to each one of you. You should have your papers in for your culture paper in tonight. I will reply to those by email, probably by email individually. So that'll take a while to go through, but I really enjoy reading it. This is such an interesting class. I mean, we got people from the Netherlands to people with families from Ireland and Italy and Czech and Poland and farm families. And we've got East Coast and West Coast and Alaska and Hong Kong and Japan and Mexico. So we got all kinds of interesting things. And we got some Nebraskans in there too, or connections. So there's a lot of really good stuff in here. So, all right, I've said that part. So if you panic about anything, you should never panic in this class. I'm not picky about, if you're a little late for something, it's not the end of the world. I understand you're graduate students, so I try to give you some leeway. And you're working, you're not just full-time students waiting for the weekend. You got families and all kinds of things going on. So, all right, now, on this handout I sent you, now this is the handout, it's about 7 or 8 pages. Now, there's 3 stages. The third stage actually has some areas where you can click and after you download it, you can watch videos. But I've got a better example of this, and I can't locate it because I've made so many different ones. So I may replace this, but it'll look just like this, but it'll have more videos. Right now, the only videos I have go with stage 3, and I know I did one with stage 1 and 2 also. Anyhow, what's my purpose in introducing the intercultural awareness? Well, we all like to, we're always hearing about diversity, and people praise it, and some people curse it, and some people don't know what to do about it, and some people say it's there, I don't know what. But how do we actually talk about diversity and do something about it? How do we interact with people that are different from us? Well, partly in your week 3 talks, you reflected a lot on your own background, your own culture, and that's the first big step. because you think about that I do have a culture, and my culture has certain rules, and certain people come in and they break the rules and they don't get to participate in stuff, and or I'm in another culture like in Hong Kong or Japan or something. In some aspects of it, I'm not able to participate in. Some parts I'm a foreigner or I'm an outsider, and maybe I remember one of them talking about the Netherlands, I think it was Netherlands, that with the Dutch, that they're very nice people, but still it's hard to become one of them, to really join the inner sanctum of this town. And by the way, that happens, as I noted in your papers, it happens in little towns in Nebraska. I had a guy tell me once, he said, I was moved to this little town and they told me that I really won't be a member of the town until I have a child there. And I thought, wow. So you have to have children born in the town before you're really more or less accepted. I said, that's a pretty high demand. You know, it's like joining a social club or something. And oh, your kids have to be born before, and we have to stamp them before you become one of us. So there's some pretty tough little groups that it's tough to get in and be a part of them. I think most of you, since you move around, you're very well aware of this. Okay, 3 stages. I'm going to simplify this from the beginning and get a little more complicated as we go. There's 3 stages, and this guy, Milton Bennett, and I adapted a little bit to my own version of it. There's actually 6 stages, but we don't worry about the last 3 because they have to do when you live in another culture. This would be interesting to the people that are in overseas in particular. But the first stage is, I call invisibility or denial. Now, what do I mean by denial? I've got many examples here. One of the denials is homeless people. When you go to, I've been to Denver and I've been places where there are homeless people. And for the most part, depending on where you are, people try to avoid interacting with homeless people. You don't see people going down saying, how are you? Why are you homeless? Can I get you something? In some towns and cities, you don't even, I've noticed on one of those, you don't wave at people. It's not the friendly thing to do. You don't interact with people if you don't know them. You just keep your eyes to yourself. You get on the subway, you just attend to your own business. You don't just talk to strangers. Small town America, we tend to talk to strangers because we don't think the local people are going to be a threat to us. But people do. And so what does this mean, invisibility? It means you don't see them. The one thing I like about this, it talks about not only how you think, but how the person feels who's on the other end of it. How does a homeless person feel? Have you ever moved to a place? Have you been a kid in a crowd or been in a class or been in a group and you felt like no one paid attention to you? You weren't acknowledged at all. Maybe visiting relatives and somehow somebody just skipped over you like you weren't even there. And so you're invisible. And that's really very tragic. And there's a very negative aspect to this. You say, well, I didn't hurt them. Yeah, but you're not going to help them. And one of the best examples I know of is homeless people or people that are in a town where they're not particularly welcome. There was a lady in Lexington many years ago that had 2 children, and she was living with a guy. And she worked at the meatpacking plant. I think she did. And all I know is from the story is that she came up missing, and no one could find her. And no one really, they looked for her, but nobody knew. They said, well, these people, they move around, who knows? And so her sister came and got the kids, and it kind of just disappeared, I always compare it to what if I, who lived in Lexington, or, people know me, they know my wife. If my wife or I disappeared and suddenly I wasn't there anymore, people would say, where's Glenn, or where's his wife? And people would say, well, they wouldn't just quit after a couple of weeks and say, well, who knows what he did? He just took off. People would not allow it to drop. They would keep asking questions. Well, the end of this story is that that lady was kind of forgotten about, except by her relatives, but they weren't really part of the community. They were outsiders. And it wasn't until 2 or 3 or 4 years later that a guy was renovating the house and he found her body under the porch where she'd been wrapped up in plastic and left after she'd been murdered. And they found the guy that she lived with. I think he convicted him of second-degree murder, and he went to prison. He was already in jail. But the point is, she was invisible. And I hope that story gets this point home. Invisibility are refugees and camps and places we don't know about, or if we know about them, we don't worry about them. Invisibility are the elderly in nursing homes, people that have outlived their generation, or people that have been sick, or people that don't have many contacts. Your heart goes out to them when you think about them, but a lot of times we don't think about them. So it could be people in many different places, and invisibility is one of the worst stages of all because you're not acknowledged. This is true even if you have children in your class and people tend to just ignore them. You know, some little kid in the back of the class, may not be any particular reason, but they just seem to be overlooked all the time. They're invisible. And that's a terrible situation to be in. Mother Teresa, if anybody knows about Mother Teresa of Calcutta, she made it her business to find people that were invisible. She started out picking up some guy that was laying in trash, dying, and took him someplace, cleaned him up so he could die in a clean place. So he didn't die like an animal, just rotting in garbage. And that's one of the great, most powerful examples I can think of. Now, the question is, what this little awareness thing does, it says things like, it gives examples, what people say at this stage, what kind of behavior do we have, how we may feel about them. I always like to add, how do they feel, how they're treated. They may not even be aware of things. They may be a person with dementia or someone who's not conscious anymore, or, you know. So what can you do? And there's a little thing in here, it needs to be much bigger. What can be done? Gather information about this person or people like them in their situation. It may be a minority, it may be a group of people with a disability, it may be a group of people that are simply overlooked for some reason. How do you reach out to them? How do you explore their culture? How do you make them matter? That's what this whole thing is about. How do you make people matter that don't seem to be on the radar at all? Okay, I just want you to get that part down for right now. This is kind of long and windy, and I use a lot of historical examples for those who like history. The second stage is one you're very familiar with. And by the way, we have a video called 9500 Liberty, which took place in Manassas, Virginia, in about 2003, I believe it was. And I'm going to let you watch it. I'm not going to tell you what it's all about, but it has all these stages. The second stage is the defense against difference. What is this stage? I call it siege mentality. We have these homeless people, and instead of ignoring them, I'm now fearful of them. We got to do something about them. We got to move them out of town, or we've got to do something. Generally, it's not a positive move. It's kind of like, let's get the homeless people and somehow roust them out and run them out of town. You know, kick them out of the park. We don't want them around our park. You get the mind. It's the same thing. It's the large group, generally the large group, a majority of people, or the people have been there, and they find this group around them and they get very upset about them. They say, we don't want these homeless people here. We've gone from ignoring them to where they've done something, or we're afraid of them. We have to go after them. We have to stop them. We don't want them to have a homeless shelter in town. We don't want that, because we're building our walls. We're building walls, not mentioning anybody's name, building walls, and we're going to block people. We're going to keep them out because this is our place. This goes back thousands of years. What do you see When you go back to the ancient times, walls. Athens had a wall to stop the Spartans. Mesopotamia, they built walls against other city-states. The Egyptians, they usually had the desert was their wall. They had a perfect desert that nobody could survive in, and they had water around them, so they had more defenses. In the Middle Ages, people built castles, and what did they have to have? They had to have walls. You could stay in the walls, and if you had enough food and stuff and could hold out, nobody could take your castle. And then somebody invented cannons and brought them along. It came from China, by the way. Those knights didn't think of cannons. Okay, so what do we see in the modern day? Well, I give you some examples here. One is there's a video here. It actually talks about there was a protest wanting amnesty and rights for immigrants. And what apparently happened in Los Angeles is it was said that the police arrested the protesters more than the people that were attacking the protesters. This goes way back. This is no ding against police officers in general. We don't want to do that. But we're talking about the specific circumstance of this protest in Los Angeles and how the city handled that. Now, I picked another historical example that most of you would have no idea about because it's not mentioned much in history. In 1932, 1931, right after the Depression had really sunk in, the United States had a lot of people suffering. And many men who had served in World War I believed that they were entitled to a bonus, a World War I bonus, some money. I don't know if it was $500, $1,000 or something, but they said they never received it. And so they all went to Washington. Herbert Hoover was president. He wasn't popular. And they set up all these camps all over Washington, D.C. and protested. Now remember, these were white protesters. These weren't minorities. These were American veterans. And finally, the president got upset about it, and he ordered the Army, the U.S. Army, under Douglas MacArthur, the war hero of World War II. He ordered the Army to beat up these guys and kick them out of town. So he used the Army against Army veterans. You can imagine how that wouldn't go over well today if you used the Army to attack Army veterans. It would cause ugliness beyond you could imagine. So they did that, and they drove them out. That made Hoover even more unpopular. And when I read about this, I changed my opinion about Douglas MacArthur using the actual military as a police force to beat up people and drive them out of town, especially when you attack your own group. Army attacking veterans is unthinkable, you know. When the groups are different than you, that's how it usually happens in history, but in this case, it wasn't. Now, what happened in the Civil Rights era, you can look at 1,000 videos about this, but maybe I guess I lost my civil rights. Well, whatever. There's videos about this, but you could look up almost anything about civil rights. In the 1950s, and particularly in the 1960s, African Americans marched in many towns and cities, particularly in the South. They protested not having the right to vote. They protested poll taxes. They had to pay a tax in order to vote, and they could never pass the test to pay the tax, so they could never vote, and that kept them from voting and kept them out of politics. They marched. People used dogs to attack them. That was famous. There was a bridge down there named after a former leader of the Ku Klux Klan. And they marched over that bridge, and that was all on television. And it turned the North and the West against the South. People were outraged and felt that blacks were being beaten, and children and everyone else. And dogs were used to attack people, and that's what really upset people. That's an example of the people in the minority trying to assert their rights, and the people resisting, the people that are in defense, saying we're going to beat the crap out of you and you are going to obey the rules or we'll put you in jail. And you know about Martin Luther King and all that. Now that stuff hasn't disappeared. This continues. There's still issues about voting rights. There's still, and that's red hot issue now. And there's still issues about treatment and jailing and mass incarceration. So these are powerful issues that continue to exist. But this isn't the only example. I've shown you the example of the Washington veterans going to Washington to get their rights, and they were treated. So you can take this stage, the first and second and the third stage when I describe it, and you can find examples in other cultures. The purpose of this sensitivity document is not to teach American history, but to help people reflect on how people interact, big groups against small groups. You could almost see it as biological when people see another group as invaders or a disease or something attacking them, and they are threatened by them. It's not unnatural to be afraid. But what I want you to learn from these stages as I'm talking about them is that these happen in all kinds of cultures. This is not, this little example, this framework is not designed just to explain American culture or Indian culture from India or Chinese or anything else, but it's designed to look at human behavior in large groups. Okay, and you can find this in a classroom. You don't have to go to some large protest and say, this is a group over here. You can find it in religion, any kind of difference that makes a difference. Men and women marching for their rights. The suffragettes back in the 1920s in Europe and the United States, they were thrown in jail. These nice, well-dressed white women that went to protest to have the right to vote were treated like criminals. They were sentenced to jail and they were punished. In England, if you were a protester but from the upper class, they protected you and kind of shuffled you off to the side. And your parents told you not to do that again, that they couldn't protect you forever. But if you were just a common person, you went to jail. It was a social class issue there. So this can apply to social class. Now the third, what do you do in the defense? In the defense, the one thing to remember is that what needs to be done, you need to find what people have in common so that you can build bridges for understanding. So if I say the group A over here is coming into my group B and I'm upset with them, if I'm a teacher who's trying to bring this together, dealing with it in the classroom, I try to find where people can be, where we can find common. Do we share common food? Do we share common religion? Do we share common belief? Do we have a certain traditions? What can we do to heal ourselves, to bring about, rather than say, I'm going to fight you to the death, or I'm going to fight you, and there'll never be peace between us. Some of you mentioned on your culture thing about, they were Catholic and they married into a Methodist, and some people wouldn't go to the wedding. Well, that would be an example of this. Where's the common ground? Well, by the way, it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't even happen in 10 years sometimes, or 100. Depends on what's going on and whether it can be healed. Religion is a real common one for this conflict, but it depends on time. Now it's politics. Now we got this impeachment talk and all this going on. I'm not going to argue sides on this. I'm just going to observe, because I like this, because it lets me observe. It lets me not say I'm really angry and I'm for this side against this side. Well, actually, I do have opinions on everything. But my point in presenting this to you is for you to analytically look at what's going on and see what needs to be done. So if you're looking for common bridges, you won't be doing things like in this stage, trying to get people more upset and more angry. That does not work. If I get you more upset and more angry, then I'm making the situation more intolerable. This doesn't work in every case. If the Nazis had somehow invaded the United States as they did Europe, you don't go up to the Nazis and say, let's try to find common ground. Maybe we can work together on this. Because the Nazis weren't interested in common ground. They were interested in wiping you out. So let's make this clear that if someone's interested in exterminating you or whatever it is, just wiping out every aspect of your culture, this is an accusation now going on against China, that in Western China, that they're trying to wipe out Islamic culture. We don't know quite enough about it, but it doesn't look good. But this has happened in history. Certain groups have destroyed other groups. That's not our purpose here. Our purpose here is to try to find a way to peace. And that means not being agitated or agitating others. Okay, stage 3. Stage 3 is a very interesting stage because a lot of people think it's not that bad. Because what you're saying is, I know that you're different than me, but I know deep down you're really just like me. Now, consider that for a minute. Wouldn't you be insulted if somebody went up to you and you have a certain set of beliefs? All of you mentioned in your discussion that you have certain religious beliefs or philosophical beliefs or your opinion about God or whatever. And if somebody went up to your family and said, we know that deep down you really want to be like us. So I'm going to work with you and I'm going to eventually turn you into me. This has often been the accusation against people who go on missions or missionary work. And the example historically would be when the explorers brought the missionaries over from Europe, and they went to the Native Americans and they said, you know, what you do, you need to change and be a Christian. Okay. Now, when I mention that and people say, well, that was the right thing to do. Well, I don't agree. But the point is that whatever religion went out, whatever philosophical belief, so I'm not just talking about religion, I'm talking about whatever the mindset is that you want them to adapt your mindset, that it comes at the cost of them giving up everything or giving much up of what they were. So you can see if someone came to me and said that what a crazy example, they wanted me to give up my philosophical beliefs. You don't know what they are, but I'd share them with you, but I don't think I'd have to explain so long. We'd be here for 3 hours. But if I had to give up my philosophical beliefs or my belief in how I can think about the world, and I had to give that up, I would consider that destroying me. Just like when someone goes up and they say, oh, they believe this, they have this deep, and I could say religious belief or philosophical belief, and I'm going to change that. I'm going to root that out of them. I don't like that. I'll just tell you, I don't like it. Because you fundamentally want to change something that is inherently part of what they are. It's material. When I read your cultural discussions, I could see how strongly you believe family, the Nebraska way, how to treat strangers, how to help your neighbors, how to teach and what education means, how important education is, how important memories are. All this stuff is what makes up who you are, just like your body. And to go in and take any of that away or to disparage it is, to me, for me to have the attitude that I'm sure that you're wrong in your thinking, and I want to set you straight on this. There's nothing more insulting than that. We have to respect the boundaries of human integrity. And that's what I feel about this. And I say the condescending attitude, it can be said in many simple ways. I remember a guy once told me his wife was of a different religion, and he was coming to my house trying to convert me to his religion. And he came in there and he said, well, my wife was a whatever. And he said, but I fixed her. and he had this one gold tooth in his mouth and laughed about it, like he fixed her. I once had a person tell me that there were minority children. I was teaching in Lexington. The guy went up to me and said, "What are you going to do about these kids? You going to fix them?" And this was another teacher. And the word, bang, idiot. Not fixing them. There's nothing wrong with them. They need to learn English, and you need to learn respect for other people. God, sorry. I get upset when I even think about that. I thought about this guy was a lay speaker in a church, and I thought, how could he be in that church and have that attitude, you know? Okay, well, stage 3. The people you're working with are unique. They have a different culture, a different outlook on the world, and you are to interact with them and to develop a respectful relationship with them. We're talking normal people. I mean, we're talking people that are not, you know, I mentioned the Nazis a while ago. I mean, you don't go up and say, well, my friend was a Nazi, but I think I can talk him down from, you know, that's the most extreme example I can think of. And almost nobody's going to call up and say, Dr. Tracy, you insulted Nazis on your videotape. I'm willing to stand behind my insult to them. Okay. So the example in here, the Native Americans, and it actually talks about how they were forced to change and give up their culture. I personally think that has a lot to do with what's going on with Native Americans today, because it was such a terribly unhealthy and unfair thing to do. Is it happening still? Go to the Brazil. Only there, people just kill the native people. If they want to take over some land and burn the land, use it for cattle, they'll go in with automatic weapons and shoot the people that have been living there for thousands of years. Wipe them out of existence. That's not even condescending. That's just extermination. So when you look at these 3 stages, you have to think, what is the motivation of the majority in dealing with the minority? Is it to respect them, to understand them? Is it to change them, drive them away, or forcibly change them, or gradually kind of trick them and force them to be like you? Because you would find it horrible if somebody wanted to come here and take away Nebraska culture or Michigan culture and or whatever country you're from, whatever region you're from, whatever language you speak. The memories that I read about, people talking about their family, extended family, and your memories, it was so powerful. I could smell things, I could hear things. Somebody in I think the second class mentioned about their grandmother passing away, and there's a beautiful part about after the funeral, everybody was doing what they always did. They were cleaning. They cleaned up after the dinner, after the grandmother's funeral, and they're putting everything away in the church. And there was a little conversation, but it was the rhythm of how life had always been. Life is being affirmed, and the way of the people is being affirmed. And that's a precious thing. And that's why we have to respect when other groups come into our community, or if we end up in a community where we're different and they're different. It could be that you can only compromise so much. I do believe that. You can't compromise everything. You have to be a point at which you behave respectfully, but you are who you are. You have to be there. And those limits have to be observed. You know, there shouldn't be anger. There shouldn't be hatred. Maybe you have to move away. Maybe you can't live in a certain community anymore. Or maybe you can take a different job because you don't like that particular place, you know. So these 3 stages, which I'll be referring to, I want you to get them down. Let's go over them one more time. Invisibility or denial. You're not there. I don't see you. I don't care about you. You don't matter to me because I don't even see you. But then the second stage is, you're a threat to me. I have to do something about you. That's when it gets outwardly dangerous. You know, before I'd ignore you and you'd die in a corner in the woods. There was a homeless guy who used to come to all over Lexington and stuff, and I forgot his name, but he wasn't a very pleasant fellow from what some people have said. And it was sad. I mean, he might have been ill. And for a while, nobody saw him. And then I said to somebody, I wonder if he went somewhere. Somebody said he went. And somebody said, no, they found him over by the, I forget what they call it, where the not swans, where the cranes go, the crane place. We have a place where cranes, sandhill cranes come. Sorry, I've lived here and haven't been there yet. Isn't that terrible? But they said that, no, they found him over there in the road. He died. He either got hit or he froze to death. And I thought that was total invisibility. He died like a roadkill somewhere. And that was it. His name was Dennis. I remember his name now. And I thought, who wept for Dennis? So anyhow, ultimately, we don't want to be alone at the end of our lives. We want to think our lives mattered. And we want to think that we treated others fairly. So I see all this, even in this class, as a very moral and spiritual thing. Not religious in that sense, not a particular, but a way of seeing the world and of respecting the world. So that's all I got to say about it. I hope this little bit is not too long and not too trying for you. And I say I did record it. I just have this fear sometimes. One time I talked for like 30 minutes and looked up. I'd just been talking to myself. So I'm going to share this with you tonight. And this will be our stuff for the next week. And there's quite a bit to look at. And don't get too upset about 9500 Liberty, even though it's actually a documentary filmed as it happened. So the people in the documentary actually interacted with, it wasn't after the fact, it was during the fact. Very political too, I'm going to say that too. And it certainly has a great application to politics now. I'll let you make those connections. Thank you.